On November 19, 1942, a German Panzer IV rolled to an abrupt stop roughly 12 kilometers southwest of Stalingrad. The vehicle had not been crippled by Soviet artillery, nor had its engine failed under mechanical strain. Instead, the machine had simply exhausted its fuel supply. Its commander, Unteroffizier Ernst Bauer, later recorded in his field journal that less than an hour earlier the gauge had still indicated nearly a quarter tank remaining. While Soviet guns hammered the frozen plains in the distance, the 40-ton tank sat motionless in the snow like a steel tomb, immobilized because somewhere between the rear supply depots and the front line, the gasoline intended to keep it alive had vanished. Bauer's predicament was far from unique. In the 72 hours following the launch of Operation Uranus, dozens upon dozens of German armored vehicles along the southern sector of Army Group B were abandoned by their own crews. Many had never been hit by enemy fire. They had not burned in battle or suffered catastrophic damage. They had merely run empty. Engines silent. Tracks frozen in place. Entire armored formations stranded across the steppe because the fuel sustaining them could no longer reach the front. On paper, such a collapse should have been impossible. By the standards of 1942, German military logistics represented one of the most sophisticated systems in Europe. The Wehrmacht's Quartermaster Corps operated through rigid schedules, endless documentation, and carefully calculated supply allocations. Fuel requests passed through layers of bureaucracy with near-industrial precision. The famous Opel Blitz trucks, which formed the backbone of German transportation networks behind the front, carried more than 2 tons of cargo and rolled out of factories at remarkable rates throughout the war. Compared to this, Soviet logistics appeared deeply inferior. Roads were primitive, railway infrastructure outdated, and administrative systems had been severely weakened by Stalin's purges before the war. German officers frequently dismissed the Red Army as incapable of sustaining large-scale operational maneuver over vast distances. Most military analysts believed Soviet forces lacked both the technical expertise and organizational discipline necessary to wage a logistical war against Germany. In one sense, those assumptions were accurate. The Soviet Union could not outmatch Germany through efficiency alone. But Soviet planners had already realized they did not need to. Rather than attempting to outperform the Germans within the same logistical framework, Soviet strategists pursued something far more devastating. Their objective was not to build a better supply system. It was to ensure the German one could never function properly at all. This approach went far beyond conventional attacks on supply lines. It evolved into a calculated campaign of denial, sabotage, environmental destruction, and attrition designed to suffocate mechanized warfare itself. Military doctrine during the early 1940s treated armored conflict primarily as a contest of transportation capacity. The army capable of moving fuel, ammunition, replacement parts, and reinforcements faster than its opponent would ultimately dominate the battlefield. German operational theory, refined during the invasions of Poland and France, depended heavily on concentrated armored breakthroughs known as Schwerpunkt operations. The success of these offensives relied upon maintaining short and stable supply corridors behind rapidly advancing panzer formations. A single German panzer division consumed astonishing quantities of fuel during active combat operations. Panzer III tanks alone required hundreds of liters daily simply to maneuver effectively across combat zones. German planners believed their system could sustain these demands so long as supply convoys remained within roughly 2 days of the advancing spearheads. Soviet commanders understood this dependency perfectly. What they understood better than the Germans, however, was how vulnerable such dependence truly was. To German officers, their logistical system represented efficiency and resilience. To Soviet strategists, it represented a fragile machine that could be quietly dismantled piece by piece. One Soviet planning memorandum attributed to Colonel General Alexander Vasilevsky summarized the philosophy with chilling simplicity: the enemy does not need to be destroyed on the battlefield if he cannot even reach it. The key to this strategy often lay in places most German commanders never considered important: wells, reservoirs, rail transfer points, and fuel storage facilities. Beginning in late 1941, Soviet partisan detachments and NKVD demolition units operating under Stalin's Directive No. 428 launched a systematic campaign across territories likely to be occupied by advancing German armies. Freshwater sources were poisoned, collapsed, contaminated, or rendered unusable from regions stretching between Bryansk and Rostov-on-Don. At first glance, water shortages might seem insignificant compared to ammunition or fuel. Yet German armored vehicles depended heavily on clean water supplies. The Maybach HL-120 engines powering the Panzer III and Panzer IV required constant radiator maintenance and coolant replenishment, especially during freezing winter operations. Without access to reliable water, maintenance crews were forced to improvise with contaminated meltwater or operate engines with dangerously low coolant levels. Engines overheated, components failed prematurely, and repair crews burned precious fuel while idling stationary vehicles during maintenance attempts. But the destruction of water infrastructure was only one layer of the Soviet campaign. The truly devastating element involved fuel depots themselves. During the catastrophic Soviet retreats of 1941 and 1942, Red Army engineers consistently prioritized the destruction of petroleum storage facilities before abandoning territory. Hundreds upon hundreds of depots, transfer stations, and railway fuel hubs were deliberately ruined ahead of German advances. These demolitions were executed with remarkable precision. Soviet engineers often drained enormous fuel reserves directly into surrounding soil before detonating storage tanks. The intention was not merely to deny the Germans usable fuel immediately, but to permanently contaminate the ground itself. German recovery teams attempting to salvage remaining fuel frequently discovered only sludge mixed with dirt, debris, and sand thick enough to destroy engines and clog filtration systems within minutes. At the same time, Germany's own engineering assumptions began working against them. German fuel transportation relied heavily on 20-liter jerrycans sealed with rubber gaskets. These containers functioned effectively across the road systems of Western Europe. On Soviet terrain, however, the situation became disastrous. Endless vibrations from deeply rutted roads, frozen mud, broken tracks, and primitive infrastructure caused seals to fail at alarming rates. Fuel leaked continuously during long-distance transport. As convoys crawled across the Soviet Union's brutal road network, thousands upon thousands of liters simply vanished before ever reaching frontline units. The consequences became increasingly visible during Operation Blue in the summer of 1942, when German forces launched their massive offensive toward the Caucasus and the Volga River. The 4th Panzer Army advanced hundreds of kilometers in only weeks, seemingly achieving spectacular operational momentum. Yet beneath the appearance of success, German armored strength was steadily collapsing. By mid-July, some panzer divisions possessed fewer than a third of their operational tanks. Not because Soviet anti-tank guns had annihilated them, but because vehicles sat stranded awaiting fuel deliveries that never arrived. Convoys became trapped in oceans of mud after sudden weather changes transformed dirt roads into impassable swamps overnight. Fuel was consumed by the trucks transporting it. More leaked away during transit. Some shipments simply disappeared entirely before reaching frontline depots. Captured German logistics officer Hauptmann Wilhelm Krebs later described one particularly revealing incident following his capture near Kalach-on-Don in late 1942. His battalion had been ordered to transport approximately 40,000 liters of aviation fuel to a Luftwaffe airstrip near Potomnik. The 90-kilometer journey consumed 11 exhausting hours over shattered Soviet roads. When the convoy finally arrived, leaking containers, contaminated fuel, and multiple truck fires had reduced the usable supply by nearly a third. The consequences extended far beyond transportation statistics. Luftwaffe fighters stationed at the airfield flew dramatically fewer missions the following day. German troops under Soviet attack later that afternoon received little effective air support and suffered severe losses as a result. Krebs estimated that throughout the summer campaign of 1942, more than 20% of all fuel handled by his battalion disappeared through leaks, mechanical failures, contamination, or transport losses alone. Meanwhile, Soviet partisan groups intensified the crisis even further. NKVD records declassified decades after the war revealed that partisan formations destroyed or contaminated millions of liters of German fuel across occupied territory during 1942. These operations rarely resembled dramatic ambushes or cinematic explosions. Instead, sabotage was often painfully simple. Water, abrasive materials, and even sugar were introduced into exposed fuel stocks at German collection sites. The damage usually remained undetected until the contaminated fuel reached engines deep at the front. By then it was already too late. German workshops reported enormous increases in fuel system failures compared to earlier campaigns in Western Europe. Engines seized unexpectedly. Fuel pumps failed. Filters clogged. Vehicles broke down under conditions where German engineering had previously seemed nearly unstoppable. None of this occurred by accident. Soviet planners had recognized a brutal truth about mechanized warfare that German doctrine underestimated: a tank does not need to be destroyed to become useless. It only needs to stop moving. And immobilizing a tank required far fewer resources than destroying one outright. German armored engineering emphasized speed, firepower, and mechanical sophistication. The Maybach engines powering German tanks represented genuine technological achievements, admired even by their enemies. Yet that same complexity became a liability across the vastness of the Soviet Union, where winter cold, endless distances, poor infrastructure, and constant logistical disruption transformed mechanical precision into fragility. Soviet high command understood that German armored warfare depended upon uninterrupted supply at a staggering scale. A single panzer army operating at full tempo required thousands of tons of daily support. Any system demanding such constant input could eventually be strangled. The partisan raids, scorched earth demolitions, fuel contamination campaigns, and transportation sabotage were not isolated acts of desperation. By 1942, many had been centrally coordinated under NKVD Special Operations Directorates issuing standardized instructions to resistance groups operating behind German lines. Fuel received highest priority. Ammunition came second. Food ranked third. The reasoning behind this hierarchy was brutally practical. A hungry soldier could continue fighting for days. A tank without fuel became worthless within minutes. German logistics had performed brilliantly in earlier campaigns across Poland and France, where paved roads, moderate climates, and short operational distances favored rapid movement. The Soviet Union offered the exact opposite. Roads visible on reconnaissance photographs during summer became impassable seas of mud after autumn rainstorms. Distances appearing manageable on planning maps consumed double the expected fuel once heavy convoys began moving through snow, ice, and collapsing dirt tracks. Soviet commanders possessed one overwhelming advantage that German staff officers in Berlin could never fully replicate: intimate understanding of the terrain itself. That understanding gradually transformed German operational superiority into paralysis. When Operation Uranus finally encircled the German Sixth Army around Stalingrad in November 1942, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus still commanded a massive and heavily armed force on paper. Yet what his army increasingly lacked was mobility. Fuel reserves inside the pocket could sustain only a handful of days of serious armored operations. The Luftwaffe airlift intended to resupply the trapped army failed catastrophically, delivering only fractions of the necessary tonnage. Part of that failure stemmed directly from the same fuel shortages crippling forward German airfields throughout the region. The Sixth Army ultimately collapsed not simply because Soviet troops fought harder in direct combat, but because months earlier Soviet planners had already begun dismantling the logistical foundations necessary for German mechanized warfare to survive. By the decisive final stage of the battle, many of Germany's most feared armored vehicles no longer represented instruments of blitzkrieg. They sat frozen and powerless across the steppe, engines silent beneath layers of snow, abandoned not by enemy shells alone, but by the slow and methodical destruction of the fuel system that sustained them. In the end, one of the most devastating weapons of the Eastern Front was not a tank, an artillery piece, or an aircraft. It was the quiet decision, made months earlier by Soviet demolition teams, to pour fuel directly into frozen earth long before the Germans ever arrived.